Well, welcome to this week's Tidal Flooding Talk. I'm meteorologist Dan Skeldon, along with my co-host, meteorologist Joe Martucci. Palma is taking the week off, well-deserved, and celebrating the holidays. Of course, Hanukkah last week, Joe. We got Christmas, we got Kwanzaa this week, and the end of the year in sight, the start of meteorological winter. Well,
hmm
what astronomical winter, I guess. So all winters are underway as of this week as well. A lot going on.
Yeah, don't forget about solar winter either, Dan.
Oh, that's
That
right.
that shortest quarter of the year. We're already fun fact for people. We actually had our earliest sunset of the year a few weeks ago, right around December the 9th. And our sunsets are getting later. However, our sunrises keep getting even more later. And that's why we have the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year on the 22nd. For Christmas, I'm going to hope that my breath or coughing or asthma or something heals itself in the next 30 seconds because I have a lot of questions for Joseph, who's going to be our guest here today, and I want to get into it. But let's welcome him in. Joseph Trujillo-Falcon. He is an associate professor at the University of Illinois. I should also mention my fellow research paper buddy. We
Nice.
did a research paper that came out this year on quote the emergence of digital meteorology certifications, standards, and education for an evolving field. He was the lead author. I was just a lowly co-author on this. So he made it all happen. But I think everyone's going to really like this conversation. He's a super smart guy. He's a young guy. He's only, fresh off of his PhD and really making a lot of good changes in terms of disseminating weather information to more people so that they can take actions on it. And he does that by translating into the Spanish language, which, as a non-Spanish speaker, is more complicated than I thought it was. So anyway, long intro, but well-deserved for him. Joseph, thanks for coming on Tidal Flooding Talk.
Thank you so much for having me. So excited to chat today.
Awesome. Yeah. So let's just start off with this. Where are you from? What got you interested in weather? And take it away.
Yeah, well, I was born in Lima, Peru, but moved to the United States when I was 5 years old. And it was actually the particular experiences of severe weather happening around me. Usually you hear the instances of people being fanatics of weather. I was actually horribly afraid of it because in Peru, we never experienced tornadoes or any kind of extreme weather for that sort. And so I was often the one translating for my own family on what to do. What even is a tornado? What should we do about that from floods to winter storms? I grew up in Dallas, Texas, and so you experienced quite a bit of everything. And initially, I was going to go into the broadcast meteorology field in Telemundo or Univision to go out and communicate everything in Spanish, but realizing the lack of resources for languages other than English, we've charted out a research journey instead, which led me here to the University of Illinois, where in the Department of Climate Meteorology and Atmospheric Sciences and the Department of Communication, we're bridging these two fields together to create effective solutions for more than the 68.7 million Americans who don't speak a language or do not speak English at home. And also English speakers. I feel like everyone collectively, we must address this issue just because our forecasts are getting way, way better, but our communication needs to keep up.
Yeah, I fully agree, Joe. So, I mean, Joe and I talk with so many, a different multitude of guests all the time. The forecasts can be great and they have gotten better and better. But, if people aren't hearing, if people aren't understanding the forecast, if the communication breaks down, that forecast is not as valuable as it should be. So what you're doing is fantastic. Let me ask you this question right off the bat. What's the biggest challenge in what you're doing that you've confronted so far?
Well, it really is a language barrier overall. There's terms beyond the English language. I mean, here in the United States, we experience all kinds of hazards, from winter hazards to tropical to flooding. And in areas across the world, sometimes they don't experience those kinds of hazards. And so at times, there's not even a word to define it. For example, in the Arabic language, the word tornado and hurricane are actually the same word, a rotating column of wind. And so if we can't describe the hazard to somebody, how can we expect them to take it seriously? And that's where we've been working proactively with NOAA and the National Weather Service to even train artificial intelligence to automatically translate in multiple non-English languages and start to create a more systematic way of doing it across the country. Because even out in New Jersey, I think it's a pertinent issue. 15% of the population speaks Spanish, 1.5 million people, and that number is only expected to grow. So it's not a matter of if, but when this becomes more consequential for our communication system across the country.
Yeah, Joseph, quick follow-up too. Going on behind me right now, we have our Spanish weathercast. So I'll do the 6 o'clock at night, our Spanish weathercast. We have a great Spanish weather team. They do the Spanish edition at 6:30, and they come in and translate our English graphics. And like Joe said, I'm a non-Spanish speaker as well, and I'm just fascinated with that translation process where they're actually looking up on their phone because sometimes there's more than one word. You have to get the right translation down, and they're doing all this, manually. And with warnings in that, you have to be quick, and in that translation process, time is of the essence. So it's eye-opening to me how much more there is to translation than the typical person thinks. You think, okay, there's one word for you know the English word, there's one word in Spanish, there's one word in French, and it just doesn't work like that, right?
Yeah, 100%, Dan. And when even the fundamental terms like thunderstorm can get translated in 8 different ways in Spanish, depending on who you talk, because depending on where you're from or how you're raised, you speak a different regional variety of the language. We have it just as much as English. So big debates between Coke versus pop and soda. We still have them in Spanish as well. And one of my favorite ones, actually, since we're out here talking to a lot of communities alongside the beach, is the term rip current. In Spanish, Puerto Ricans have traditionally translated that word into the term resaca, which makes sense for a lot of Puerto Ricans. But across the rest of Latin America, resaca means hangover. And so for a
Wow.
while, we were accidentally issuing hangover warnings for the beach, which, kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
But we're really not getting or heeding warning to the actual hazard at hand.
So I want to ask, and I'm sure you could fill a whole half hour of this, but what are some other words? Can you give us some other examples too?
Oh, of course. Yeah. Rip current is my favorite one. And then, of course, I've seen several weather apps, for example, they're translating tornado watch into like the actual watch on your
Uh,
on your hand and things like that. In Chinese, for example, atmospheric trough translates to the trough where pigs eat. And so, not necessarily the same thing there. And so it's always adding that context, not just directly translating from English, but making sure that the contextual information regarding that hazard still stays in that translation, which is why it's so unique to research. So, as a professor, I really apply communication, atmospheric science, and even a little bit of sociolinguistics because we have to understand how people talk to each other so we can develop the most effective messages and tailor it to them so that they can take precautions.
And how time consuming is this process? Because I mean, you have so many different words. I mean, so many different languages, and so many different factors that go into it. So, how tiresome? How I mean, it's valuable work. So maybe you don't find it tiresome, but it can be maybe a little like tedious because you have to cover every single base to get
Oh,
the
yeah.
most accurate translation out there. So, do you consider that like a fun challenge? Could it be a frustrating challenge?
A little bit of both, but we have a lot of energy and passion for it. But every single year, we actually release nationwide surveys to English and Spanish speakers from across the country. Kind of think about it, the recent presidential election, the recent polling that has been going on gives you a representative snapshot of what a community thinks. We don't ask folks who are you voting for president, but rather how do you respond to different weather and climate threats. And
Okay.
so every single year, we have surveys devoted to tornadoes, to winter weather, to tropical hazards, you name it, and one recently in floods too. And every single year we get that data back and we start synthesizing it, coding it up, and really seeing visually just how folks are receiving and consuming information, especially in this new digital landscape. And that's where my favorite co-author ever, Joe Martucci out
oh
here
my
now,
God, look at this firing me up.
published that
I
paper
mean, we have
because
great names. It's great names. I don't know about anything else other than that.
but yeah, no, we actually were able to visualize how people are consuming media over the last couple of years and really seeing the digital and social media just emerging. I know we've seen it anecdotally all across the country, but to actually see it in data too, as a science nerd, that fascinates me because it's now scientific data, just seeing how the public is consuming all these various types of mediums and how us as a field have to evolve to meet that challenge.
I feel like at least in English language, the one event that really said, "Hey, you know what? We need to focus on messaging," is Superstorm Sandy. And maybe we're biased because we're in we're affiliated with New Jersey, but I feel like just the way that would down and hurricane warnings, no hurricane warnings, that kind of stuff. Is there something in the Spanish language in America that would be similar? Where it was like, "Hey, we have to really take this seriously."
Oh, no, for sure. Yeah, no, well, we actually recently did a study to be able to rate the translations. We asked participants to rank in terms of levels of urgency the current translations of watch, warning, and advisory. And we actually found that the term advisory was communicating more urgency than the translation of warning presently.
Mm.
It's the word aviso that we're currently using. And it's just that's more of like a pat on the back, like, hey, you should consider doing this, not like a take action now. And so we've actually looked at the different kinds of terms that we can use to better translate that because the direct translation is technically correct, but it was missing the actual context of it. And so broader words like emergency or alerta, like alert, actually give you some of that oomph and get communities to take it seriously. But even for English speakers, as Superstorm Sandy really raised a lot of eyebrows and really inspired a lot of social science research, not just in Spanish, but in English as well. I think it's the way we communicate uncertainty, probabilities, and timescales, these and multiple hazards happening at once because Superstorm Sandy brought so many things all at once. And it's so hard to synthesize all that information. And so our research area as a whole has been trying to better understand the characteristics you need to include in a warning message for it to be considered effective. And those are including the source, the hazard, the location, making sure that there's protective guidance and timing information as well along the way. And so we've been very, very explicit with our partners to include these sorts of components so that you can hopefully make a warning message more effective in the future.
Awesome. All right, we're going to take our first break here. We'll be back on the other side with Tidal Flooding Talk.
Become a champion with us in Atlantic City.
All right, and we are continuing our conversation with Joseph here. We are talking about translating and making sure that there's better weather communication. So, Joseph, at the University of Illinois, you lead the Alertas Lab, the Advancing Language Equity and Resilience in the Atmospheric Sciences. Got to say that 3 times fast, right? So tell us about that and the work that you're doing. And is there anything actionable that has gone out to the general public as a result of the research that you're doing there?
100%. My lab consists of both atmospheric science and communication students. So it's a very unique setting where we can bring in the physical and the social sciences and bring it to life, essentially. We've studied various hazards from tornadoes to hurricanes, winter storms, floods as well. And we do this in a proactive manner. We start out by going out to the field in the aftermath of extreme weather events and talking to survivors themselves. So we're curious to know how they responded to the actual communication system when it mattered the most. We listened to their stories wholeheartedly and use some of those insights to then develop these nationwide surveys I was speaking of to see whether these trends are holding across the country. And we explicitly recruit people from various weather service jurisdictions so that we can make it into actionable policy for NOAA and the National Weather Service to say, hey, here's how your jurisdictions are currently receiving weather information. Here's some recommendations to move this forward based on feedback by the community itself. And so some things that we've been able to advance is actually this artificial intelligence a translation program with the National Weather Service where, yeah, we trained an AI over the last 4 years with all the weather and climate terminology. We brought in National Weather Service forecasters and certified translators, and using some of the social science data, we've been able to reduce translation times for some weather service products from 1 hour to 2 to 3 minutes. And especially
Wow.
in the National Hurricane Center just recently implemented this technology this last hurricane season, just because, they're forecasting for the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, which includes Central America as well. So we've actually seen some of these results already start to affect everyday lives, and we're very excited for that to make sure that, yeah, that everyone gets access to this sort of stuff. Just because previously the San Juan, Puerto Rico office was in charge of not just forecasting for the region, but translating for a good swath of the Atlantic and Pacific or Atlantic Ocean. And so it really was, that is overwhelming at its best, or really just fundamentally. And so we want to find ways to help out our various partners, end users, and most importantly, the public, because that's who we serve at the end of the day.
Awesome. And let's talk about flooding with this. We are, of course, Tidal Flooding Talk.
Yeah.
Excuse me. What can you tell us about, flooding and the translations? And, I don't know. One thing that sticks out to mind is the unfortunate flooding we had in Texas earlier this year. I'm sure you've done a lot of digging into that. So just generally flooding, and then you can touch on what happened in Texas earlier this year as well, as much as you like.
Of course. Yeah. Flooding is a very particular hazard to be able to communicate just because a lot of folks sometimes don't take it as seriously compared to other hazards. And when I mean by that, I mean they prioritize other hazards, the more flashier ones like tornadoes and hurricanes that you can see visibly with the naked eye. But with flooding, sometimes it can happen out of nowhere. And sometimes it can happen concurrently with other hazards as well. This is important to bring up Texas because so many factors went into effect when that scenario unfolded. Not only were people not cognizant of the flooding risks in the area, but there were also a lot of warning fatigue. Quite frankly, we issue so many warnings, from Amber Alerts to WIAs to all these different kinds of things. And research is currently looking into this information overload and how we can more directly address it. And so we've been very curious to see how do we communicate floods to areas like floodplains and developments where flooding is a common way of life. We actually recently did some work with my student Zoe Carroll, a master's student in communication, and she actually researched her hometown, the Shunganunga Creek in Topeka, Kansas, just because in that given area, it floods there all the time. Like people there have canoes, and it's just the everyday part of life. And we asked them, how can we better prepare you for this kind of stuff? Because campaigns like Turn Around, Don't Drown don't really work on these communities because what are you going to do? Grab your entire home and just leave? It's not practical at all. But we really found after interviewing some of these communities that are affected by recurrent floods is that we have to be more specific geographically about what we mean. Since these floodplains can be small communities, the more tailored information we can give to folks, the better. And also really launching educational campaigns well beforehand so that people can have more understanding of flooding hazards altogether and things like that. And then, of course, working together with local community partners and leaders that are better to be able to tailor that information. They call it an integrative warning team for a reason, where broadcasters, weather service, and even some community leaders can come together to propagate these messages and tailor them to folks specifically. And looking at it in different languages too, the different kinds of flash flood warnings that exist right now. You have the flash flood warning, you have the river creek flooding, the street flooding. In Spanish, a lot of that, there's really not a huge difference. The translation is not as, there's not the various kinds of floodings you can define in Spanish. We just kind of say flood overall. And so the importance of plain language messaging across the board is so critical here so that folks can consume it, not just in English, but in other languages too. And so, yeah, flooding has been a more recent hazard that we've been exploring. And more recently too, we've been looking at atmospheric rivers because they affect the Western US, but all across the United States as well. Because I've seen recently that the Scripps University has been putting out, the Scripps Institute has been putting out AR risk categories and things like that. So we're testing those out with the public as well. And so floods are a very pertinent hazard to explore, and there's a lot of solutions that we're developing.
Joseph, have you got any feedback? Like you said, you send surveys out to kind of see, how the translation is received through various parts of the country and various events. Have you got any, with flooding being recent, have any of those surveys addressed the flood warnings and the flood translations that have gone out?
So this last year's flooding survey really more focused on what kind of media sources people rely on, and then more into the atmospheric river scale. Just because, just like the Saffir-Simpson scale, there's been an effort to put out a level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 atmospheric river, and so we actually just got that data last week. So we're coding it up as we speak because we're presenting that at the American Meteorological Society conference next month, and I think it'll be a unique opportunity. And just preliminary data is already showing that, yeah, the way we define these risk categories are not communicating that urgency to the public in English and in Spanish. We saw that very similarly with the Storm Prediction Center categories. In English, sometimes they don't even make sense. And so we've done a lot of work on that, and we're kind of applying it into the flooding landscape as well. But I think in the future, too, my work is this next year's survey is going to really focus in on the theme of warning fatigue. What is the Goldilocks of sending just enough warnings to keep people safe, but not overwhelming so many people along the way too. And so that's something that we look forward to studying much richer in detail this upcoming year.
Awesome. We're going to take our final break. We'll be right back with you here on Tidal Flooding Talk. Thanks to the New Jersey Coastal Coalition, your flood insurance bills are lower and your streets safer from the reality of flooding.
Since beginning in 2013, we build more resilient shoreline communities. Our member towns develop and share in best practices that anticipate future concerns and create flooding solutions. From our town-specific free web app for flooding information to our weekly Tidal Flooding Talk show, we focus on flooding 24/7. Visit www.njcoastalcoalition.com for more.
Hey everyone, if your home is near a river, lake, or an ocean, there's an important number you should know. It's called base flood elevation, or BFE for short. The BFE tells you how high floodwater could rise during a really big flood, one that has about a 1% chance of happening in any given year. When people build or fix homes in flood areas, they try to make the lowest floor at or below this BFE line. This way, the house stays drier and safer when water comes up. Many places even build a foot or two higher for extra protection, depending on the town. You can find your home's BFE for free on FEMA's flood map website. You can type in your address and see it there. Take a minute today to look up your base flood elevation. A little knowledge goes a long way.
All right, good advice, Joe. And so, Joseph, what you're doing now at the university level, relatively new. Atmospheric science has been studied at universities for decades, but you're kind of blending the art of forecasting, social science, communication, all together. Are there a lot of universities doing that, and how novel a concept, is it where you are?
It's relatively new considering the history of our field. We've now seen recent job postings being put in meteorology departments to bring in social scientists. This really all started, one of the big markers that brought social sciences to the field was the Joplin tornado just last decade. It really prompted communities to think that we need to integrate this much more deeply. Before it was like, hey, you could do a minor in communication, just take a couple of classes. But, here at the University of Illinois, we've been creating courses. Like this semester, I'm teaching an extreme weather communication fieldwork class where the beginning of the semester, the local emergency manager comes in, gives us the three biggest challenges in communicating weather. And our class's job is to go out to the community, interview them, talk to them, understand how they're currently perceiving these risks, and coming back at the end of the semester and reporting that back to the emergency managers. It's a lot more front facing. And I think that's where our field is headed. I tell my students all the time, you don't need to be a social scientist. That's not what I'm trying to get you to do. But I want you to remember your communities, remember the people you're serving every single day, every time you make that forecast, every time you get on TV or anything of that sort. And so, yeah, our field's heading in a unique and wonderful direction here in the future. And I'm looking forward to seeing how universities adapt to this and embrace some of this stuff. Just because, yeah, and even the flooding world, we really do need to reimagine how we approach this so that we can keep people safe.
Yeah, and I was talking to somebody about this the other day. I teach a university class. I'm no Joseph, but I'm an adjunct professor at one local college here, and we were talking about just the education needed for meteorology. I said, I never took a communication. Well, I shouldn't say it. I took a half of a communications class. I didn't take any business classes or societal impact classes, but man, they would have been so helpful in college just to have a base for it. And I think as we go forward, and I know you and myself and the American Meteorological Society, we're kind of trying to see what this paradigm shift should be for meteorology. I mean, do you think, kind of a little off topic, but I almost feel like in a way, our forecasting is getting, has and will continue to get better. And we're seeing shifts at the National Weather Service to going towards that community messaging and making sure we have the right words down. I mean, how do you think a meteorology program at a university should look like? That's something that's built for the future.
Yeah, I think it requires both a blend of physical and social science classes along the way. Let's make sure that everybody's fundamentally taking the scientific courses to understand the atmosphere, but let's also take a couple of classes to learn about the societies that the atmosphere is affecting every single day. I think it's important that we at least integrate, maybe, my hot take is have one required social science course for every single meteorologist out there. Again, we're not going to ask you to be a social scientist, but I want you to think about these things because a lot of the issues that are field is currently addressing in terms of communicating warnings and things like that. There's a whole field of communication that has looked at theories and has really explored best practices in other contexts. I actually borrowed a lot of the translation research that I do right now from health communication because they have to undergo some of the very same challenges us meteorologists have to. We have to communicate complicated jargon. For them, it's medical jargon. For us, it's weather jargon. And then we have to promote protective behaviors. In health, we have to get people to take their medicine and take their health seriously, whereas here we want to keep people safe for them to seek shelter. And so I've borrowed so much from that communication class that I took as a grad student, now applying it in a weather context. And I think, there's only so much more room for growth here. So yeah, I really do think the new paradigm is coming, and I'm very excited to see how it evolve over the next couple of years.
Yeah, Joe,
Awesome.
I think you would agree, right? I mean, it should, I think, absolutely be part of the core curriculum, especially for broadcast meteorologists, meteorologists
Oh.
that communicate a forecast to the public. Sometimes, change is hard to come by in core curriculums and tried and true practices, but no, you absolutely have to evolve with the times, and I think it should be at least one course.
At least one. We're not asking for much, but I think it should be fundamental so that folks know exactly how communities are currently responding. And I think, as a whole field, we can move collectively forward with that.
Yeah, and you know what? Last point on this. There are some colleges I know that do have like different pathways,
Oh, yeah.
within meteorology, and they do include communication. I know Rutgers, where I went,
Oh,
where
yeah.
are you, baby? We had that. I don't know if it's still there right now. We had it after I left, and then I think it's gone, so it completely missed me. But yeah, for sure. All right, so we're gonna wrap this up like we do every week with the one thing we can't stop talking about: tidal flooding or otherwise. This is our Christmas week episode, Dan. So I know you're a busy dad over at the Skeldon household, wrapping gifts and waiting for Santa to come down, right?
I am. Santa's supposedly bringing a 16-foot trampoline. So what I
Wow.
can't stop talking about is I'm assembling it at my neighbors down the street, or Santa is, and it has to somehow get through the neighborhood and be anchored in our backyard by Christmas morning. So that's the one thing I can't stop talking about as to the logistics of all that. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't throw in Dreaming of a White Christmas. Last year we got one. This year might be a little more challenging.
Yeah. I still want to come. I want to come back to this trampoline in next week's episode, or maybe in January. I'm very curious there.
We'll give you an update.
Yeah. Okay. So my one thing I can't stop talking about, tidal flooding or otherwise, is this calendar is awesome this week because Christmas is on a Thursday. You got New Year's on the Thursday as well. And then you get that long weekend, which is super nice for a lot of people. I think holidays like this on a Thursday are the best. I think wasn't 4th of July on a Thursday too. I should have looked this up beforehand. Wasn't this supposed to be like the year of best holidays? Oh, it was on a Friday. All right,
Friday.
that still counts. So shout out to the calendar for doing its thing and treating us well this year. And Merry Christmas to everybody celebrating.
Uh,
Go ahead, Joseph. All you.
Oh yeah, well, I guess the one thing that I can't stop talking about in the research world is just really we need to honestly reimagine how we approach warnings. I'm such a huge nerd when it comes to this. It might be a hot take, but maybe sometime in the future, really substituting watches and warnings with just plain language messages. It's just something that I'm so passionate about. And I know that's a huge paradigm shift to ask for immediately, but I think a lot of the public can agree, let's just get straight to the point. Let's go move through the terminology and let's communicate this in a more efficient manner. And so that's been something I've been talking about in class recently. Like, let's create effective messages, but they're all grounded in non-jargon statements. And so as a professor, I always preach that to the choir so that maybe one day, after screaming at a cloud for so long, it might just hear me.
We might have to come. We might have to have you back to talk about that one. We'll come back. We'll revisit that one. Awesome. So Joseph, tell us where people can find out a little bit more about you, and we'll wrap it on up.
Yeah, I actually, you could follow me on Facebook, Meteorologo Joseph Trujillo-Falcon. I still do, I practice what I preach. So I still do forecasts in Spanish every now and
All
then.
right.
I do stuff on TikTok as well. But
Yes,
yeah,
you
I
do.
also have a Blue Sky and Twitter too,
Yeah.
at Latin WX, just because we're advocating for multilingual communities and we will continue to do so. So excited to chat on there.
Awesome. Well, Joseph, thanks so much for joining us from your hotel room in New Orleans. We're going to let you get back to all the wonderful things that New Orleans has. You don't want to be talking to us for too long. I will see you next month, though, my friend. Looking forward to it. And thanks again for coming on Tidal Flooding Talk.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right. Take care, everybody.